we'll just say we have one key light because I just have one light that's coming on from screen left, okay? And I don't have a light set up on screen right on the shadowy part of Baby Yoda. That would be this part right here. This is the fill side of Baby Yoda where you see the dark shadow. This is the key side where the light is gonna come from my fixture, which is in that direction to the screen left direction of Baby Yoda and directly hit him. That's the key side. The fill side is a side of the subject exactly opposite of the light, okay? And the part of the subject that's being directly hit by the key light, those are called the highlights. The highlights. I can see specular highlights in Baby Yoda's eyes. If I look in his eyes, I see these little pinpricks of white light. That's where the light is directly hitting his eye, and bouncing back towards the camera. It's a really shiny reflective surface. So we can really also tell a lot about the surface or the texture of an object based on how light plays with it, how light interacts with it. So if the light is shining so harshly and giving me such a hard specular, a hard and small specular highlight, when I say hard specular highlight, in this case, that means it's bright, a bright pinprick of light, and it's really small. If I see that, then I know the surface that I'm looking at, his eyes, is made up of a really reflective, maybe glassy or mirror-like surface. Okay, whereas if you look at his skin over on the key side of his face, you don't see a specular highlight. You see the brighter light on that side of the face, but you don't see a pinprick or a large specular highlight. Okay, the shadows are the opposite side of the face, and as the light wraps from the key side of his face to the shadow side of the face, the light is going to fall off. The light is going to fall off or get weaker as the intensity of the light gets weaker from the key side where it hits, where it's the strongest. As the light wraps around his face, it's going to get weaker, or you're going to have fall off. Okay, there is a zone on his face, maybe right in here, right around his or with a screen right eye or his left eye, where Baby Yoda isn't as bright as the highlight side of his face. He's not as dark as the shadow side of his face. It's somewhere in between. We call that in-between level or in-between area of exposure. We call that the midtones or the midtones. Okay, so we have highlights, shadows, and in between the highlights and the shadows, we have midtones. Okay, when we say exposure, basically what I'm saying is how much light is hitting the subject and then going into the lens of the camera so an image can be made. Okay, so if I say, in essence, I don't have enough exposure on the subject, that means the subject is not bright enough. A couple things I can do. I can either turn up the intensity of the light, or I can open up the iris on the camera to let more light in. We'll talk more about that later. And as you can probably tell, intensity is how strong or how bright is the light that is striking the subject. Intensity. Okay, that's a pretty easy one, and I'll show you varying intensities on this Yoda. You see we got zero intensity, and then we're going to turn it up, turn it up, turn it up, turn it up to full intensity. Now just saying zero intensity or full intensity, that's too vague. We need to speak in more specific terms when we talk about really everything, especially in lighting. As far as intensity in lighting, just like we measured color temperature in degrees Kelvin, 3200 degrees Kelvin or 5600 degrees Kelvin, that's our unit of measure. Anytime you're talking about any characteristic or aspect of anything you're looking at on the screen, and you talk about how bright it is, what color it is, how far it is from the camera, whatever, you always need to ask yourself, what are my units of measure? That's the only way you can have a meaningful conversation about it, and the only way you can replicate a certain look that you want or get a certain look that you want on set if you're talking in terms of specific units. For example, if I said, hey, I'm going to have a cancer walk or Black Lives Matter walk to raise money. And people say, how far are we going to walk? And I said, two. Two what? What are my units? What are my units of measure? 2 feet, 2 yards, 2 meters, 2 miles, 2 kilometers. What's my unit of measure? In the United States, we normally measure intensity in foot candles. Foot candles. Okay, you may say foot candles. That's a really strange unit of measure. It's not like an inch or a meter or a liter of liquid or a gallon of liquid. What's a foot candle? And you're going to laugh when you hear this definition of what a foot candle is. A foot candle is simply the amount of light that a standard candle gives off 1 foot away from it on a surface that's 1 foot by 1 foot square. So if I were to hold up a piece of paper 1 foot away from a candle, a standard candle, the amount of light that hits that candle will be 1 foot candle. It's a measurement of intensity of light. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure the intensity of the light striking Baby Yoda. Foot candles is just one of several different ways you can measure the intensity of light. You have foot candles. You also have lux, L-U-X. You won't run into that as often. Most of the times in the States you run into foot candles, but you can measure intensity of light in lux. You can measure intensity of light in candelas. Candelas. And you can also measure light in terms of lumens. Lumens. So you say, well, okay, how do we measure the intensity of light that's sitting on our Baby Yoda? You measure intensity using something called a light meter. And I have a light meter here, and it is a really cool gizmo.
You don't have to work and slave.
But I like the LUMU a little bit better. And for the main thing is, I always have my phone on me. So you always have your phone on you when you go out shooting for calls, for texts or whatever. So I always have my phone on me, and this is like so small, fits in perfectly in the camera, fits in with the case. So they designed it pretty well. It's pretty rugged. I thought it would bounce around or I would, move it a little bit and it would snap. None of that has happened so far. Comes in this pretty cool carrying case too. I keep it in my pocket and then go around and shoot. So you don't need to carry around this guy, so having this in your pocket, which I always have. So I always have this phone in my pocket. Adding this is not big of a deal. And always having the ability to meter on me has been more important. Using their basic app, you can just measure it. How do you use a light meter? So I'll meter this situation right here. So if the camera's pointing directly at me like it is, you want to take the light meter and put it either right underneath my eye or it's close to my eye or nose, because when you're shooting photography, portrait photography, you want to expose the eyes correctly. A lot of portrait photography is just getting the eyes right. So you want to put it under their eyes and then hit this measure button. And then you'll get your reading. You're going to change the ISO or the shutter speed to whatever you want. For video, you have specific ones, but for photography, you can mess around with that. So you want to point this reflective dome towards the camera, and that's how you're going to get the accurate meeting. If it's pointed away, it's actually going to meter like behind you. So you always want to make sure that this is pointing towards the camera, and then that it's going to measure the light, like how it's coming off, and then that's how you get proper exposures. It's a little tricky, but if the easiest way to remember is just point this at the camera, hit the button, and you're good to go.
Capitol Hill to work out a compromise health care plan.
Soccer bopper, more fun than a pillow fight.
Little gadget here you can see. This is an old iPhone 5, and this little half sphere on the top is a sensor. It's called a LUMU, L-U-M-U. They had a Kickstarter up for LUMU, I think in 2013 or 2012. And basically, it's a way to turn your smartphone into a light meter. And it's pretty good. It's not quite as accurate as the most accurate light meters, but for all intents and purposes, it does an excellent job. So the idea is I want to see how much light is leaving my LED panel and is hitting Baby Yoda on the key side of his face. Okay, so on LUMU, I don't know if you can see this, there is an illuminance mode. If I click on that, all that's going to do is just tell me how much light is hitting, and you can see, I see a little FC here, FC for foot candles, okay? And I can hit my settings button and I can choose foot candles or lux. I think those are the only two it gives me, foot candles or lux, okay? So I'm gonna stay at foot candles. I'm gonna hit my start button, bam, right there, okay? And I'm gonna point my sphere directly at the LED panel because I wanna get the most light possible coming off of that light panel, okay? And it's looking that it's about 36.5 foot candles. That's the intensity of light that's striking my Baby Yoda after it leaves the LED panel. Okay, now you have to understand you're not seeing 36.5 foot candles of light on the video screen because the amount of light that strikes Yoda, 36.5, you don't actually see Yoda until the light that strikes him goes into the lens of the camera and is turned into an image. So one thing about light is the only reason that I can even see Baby Yoda, and he has color specifically, is because of the fact that the light hits Baby Yoda, some of the light is absorbed, and whatever is left, the rest of the light goes into the lens. And so what you're seeing is not the incident light, that's the light that's coming directly from the light panel and hitting Yoda. What you actually see is the reflected light, which is the light that goes into the lens of the camera and creates the image. You say, well, why do we have to take, if we don't really see incident light, we only see reflected light, why do we really have to take an incident light meter reading in the first place? Well, the reason for that is because of the fact that incident light meter readings are good for what we call exposure ratios. Exposure ratios. That is, how much brighter is his key side of his face where the light is directly striking as compared to his fill side of his face. So for example, if I take an incident light meter reading and say it's 36.5, his key side, and then I take a fill, we call this the fill side of his face. We take a fill side and I see that this is only 12, so you get roughly 12 foot candles hitting the fill side of his face, then I know I have an exposure ratio of 3:1. Sometimes people call it a lighting ratio of 3:1. That means the light hitting the key side of his face is 3 times brighter than the light that's hitting the fill side of his face. And you say, well, how is light hitting the fill side of his face? There's no light on the camera right side of the camera, right? Yeah, there is none, but light bounces off of all surfaces. The room that I'm sitting in has kind of oatmeal colored walls, and yeah, there's lots of stuff like DVD racks and equipment all over the room. What happens is that the light is gonna bounce off the other walls, like say bounce off the wall that's screened right that you can't see, and then bounce back into the shadows or bounce back into the fill side of his face and brighten up those shadows a little bit with reflected light.